Hey there, creatives. Thank you so much for your continued listenership of the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I am so excited to share that I feel like we've reached a milestone moment and that we've broken 20,000 downloads of the show, which seems like a huge accomplishment. I remember the first couple of months of releasing episodes and, having like 7 people listen, and it was slowly crawling, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's been like 50 downloads, and that was like such an exciting moment. So to surpass 20,000 downloads, is it just feels like a really huge accomplishment, and I'm really just grateful to you all for continuing to listen and support the show. I'm really excited to share this episode with you, where I speak with a few people that are near and dear to me. And I'm really excited to share this episode of the podcast where I speak to a few people that are near and dear to my heart. And I really appreciate their contributions to the field and the profession. And I really hope that you enjoy listening to this conversation that I had with Barry Cohen, Ann Mills, and Kathryn Johnson about their work and um, years, decades worth of work that has gone into the Diagnostic Drawing Series and the supporting research and educating the public about that art assessment. And so, yeah, here's that conversation. Enjoy.
The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinicians Corner, a practice-building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential-focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Raina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative-focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Raina Lombardi.
Thanks so much for listening to the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I'm your host, Raina Lombardi, and I'm very, very excited to welcome my next 3 guests to the show. They are Barry M. Cohen, who is a retired board certified and registered art therapist, and he has authored the Diagnostic Drawing Series, the DDS, back in 1982. So we're coming on 40 years of the DDS, which is pretty exciting. And he is the co-author of journal articles and chapters, and co-authored and co-edited 3 books, including the workbook, Managing Traumatic Stress Through Art. He's the founder of the Eastern Regional Conference on Trauma and Dissociation in 1989. He co-founded an inpatient dissociative disorders unit in Washington, D.C. in 1991. And he was recruited to manage the 2006-2007 American Art Therapy Association conferences, and then went on to serve as the executive director of Expressive Media from 2008 through 2021. He founded the Expressive Therapies Summit, New York City in 2010, co-founded the Mid-Atlantic Play Therapy Training Institute with Eliana Gil in 2013, and with Ping Ho, the LA Summit in 2017. He's currently the executive director of the Expressive Therapies Summits. And we also have Kathryn Johnson, PhD, and she is also an art therapist and a licensed psychologist with over 20 years experience working in psychiatric and medical facilities. She's the senior psychologist at Everett Clinic, where she provides therapy, psychological evaluation, and neuropsychological testing. Dr. Johnson is also Medical Director of Psychosocial Services at the Providence Regional Cancer Partnership. A former instructor of research and assessment at Antioch University, Dr. Johnson has been instrumental in conducting many DDS research studies. She is the research director for the Diagnostic Drawing Series and the primary DDS teaching associate. And we have Ann Mills. And Ann Mills is also a board certified registered art therapist, a licensed professional counselor, and a licensed, I want to say it's an LCPAT. And can you explain what that is?
That's the Maryland licensure for art therapists.
Oh, congratulations. That's awesome. And Anne is the director of the Diagnostic Drawing Series archive and owner of Art Therapy Services. In private practice for over 30 years, specializations include the treatment of survivors of severe early trauma who are highly dissociative, and provides resiliency-focused treatment for adolescents and adults who've experienced difficult transitions such as illness, bereavement, and loss of culture, such as with refugees and international students. And she is the former director of the GW University Art Therapy Graduate Training Program and has published on assessment and trauma treatment. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being willing to talk about the Diagnostic Drawing Series today.
Thanks, Raina.
Happy to be here.
You.
So let's jump right in, and I'll pose this question to you, Barry. You created the Diagnostic Drawing Series. What was your inspiration for developing this assessment? How was it born?
Well, I was a graduate student at University of Louisville back in 1979, teaching for Janie Ryan. And Janie was, well, when my class was graduating, Janie herself was getting her doctorate degree and working with Rudolf Arnheim. And she is very interested in form as content and wrote a doctoral thesis about it. So that had played a pretty big influence on me. Janie was mostly interested in black and white configurations and as they express feelings. That's what she was studying. But she was looking at how people draw, how they make the marks on the page instead of what people draw, which was the way that most art therapists were looking at pictures back in those days, this sort of symbolic, projective way of looking at people's artwork. But the problem occurred to me that the projection was being done by the clinician, that they were projecting their own stuff onto the client's drawing, and then it was not an objective assessment of what Jane used to call the isness of a picture, what is on the page. And so, to make a very long story short, I got this idea that I would start a library of artwork, a national library of artwork for art therapists to study people's diagnoses and the way that they drew. And in coming to Washington, D.C. shortly after getting my degree, it was sort of like a Smithsonian of art therapy artwork in my head. That was what I wanted to create. And in speaking to all of the women, basically at that time, who were in charge of all of the programs, the response was kind of mixed in that most of them didn't understand really the need for it, and they didn't understand how it would be comparing apples to apples, so to speak, that the artwork that they collected would be judgeable and or assessed in a parallel way to the artwork of somebody else in the way that they collected it in their facility, or that the diagnoses made by whoever was making the diagnoses of the patients would be accurate, since the diagnoses were all being made by psychiatrists and psychologists who all had their own issues, so to speak. about how to diagnose, and a lot of them were impacted by insurance rules, and
Sure.
it was just kind of a morass. So my supervisor, who I was working with at the time, here in Virginia, she and I went to the head psychiatrist, who was a journal editor for several psychiatric journals, and posed this thing and said, we want to do this. We want to study these pictures. And he said, nobody will take you seriously unless you create an assessment from scratch and study it from day one and standardize everything about it. Otherwise, anything that you ever publish about your findings will not be taken seriously by anybody outside the field of art therapy, which is probably the best advice that we ever got. And so
Powerful.
we created the series with that in mind, so that it would be, everything about it would be standardized from day one, and the way that we looked at it would be standardized, the way that the diagnoses would be made, not by us, but by the psychiatrist, etc. And we would collect all of that information in a standardized way, hence the DDS archive. And that's the basic overview of how that happened more or less between 1980 and 1982.
Wow. So 2 years of extensive studying and collaboration to come up with the assessment tool. And it was standardized. At that point in 1982, it was ready to be taught to other people to
Well,
utilize.
we created a little test study to see if it was really viable, if it could really do what we thought it could do and distinguish between the different diagnoses. And that is what was then awarded the American Art Therapy Association's Research Award, which was a sort of a once in a blue moon thing back in those days, because it was not just my study, but a study for anybody in the field to collaborate in any facility anywhere in the world, and everything would be standardized, so it would all move forward the concept of assessment through art. So that happened in 1982, and that made it official, and that gave us the wherewithal to start getting the word out, photocopying the rating guide and the handbook and sending them out to people who were interested, because those were the days before email and PDFs and even fax machines. Everything was done by photocopying and a secretarial pool of the hospital, and we used all of our research award money on postage stamps. So that'll give you a sense of where it was then, and Kathryn will talk later about where we are now in the digital age with some of this.
Oh, that's so funny. So what would you say? I mean, obviously the standardization makes this a different type of art assessment, but what are the other key features that make the DDS unique in comparison to the other art assessments that are out there and that are utilized?
I might say that that was only one part of the way the DDS was developed that was according to conventional social sciences research.
Mm-hmm.
When people sort of say to themselves, I'm so fascinated by volcanoes, I'll make a volcano assessment. They're not generally thinking big. So the DDS was thinking big right from the beginning, but also using a lot of common sense. So things like having a way of controlling for the effect of psychotropic drugs, that was built into the administration criteria and protocol. And the fact that the collection was centrally coordinated. And that right from the beginning, there were two agreeing diagnosticians, two psychiatrists, one of whom could have been the admitting psychiatrist for a person on an inpatient unit, and the other one being someone who did not know the patient, who actually had to meet with them and come up with a diagnosis. if the two diagnoses didn't agree, the pictures didn't go into the archive right from the
Okay.
beginning. Yeah. So, so prior to the DDS, I like to think of the DDS as kind of like before the DDS, art therapy research design did not conform to standard social sciences research.
Mm-hmm.
But after the DDS was the first, and much later other assessments were developed. So prior to the DDS, only one aspect of conventional social sciences research was used in any art therapy study. The DDS used 11 different criteria and was the first, and then others came later. But basically, the form as content notion is really central. That, as Barry said, before the DDS, there was sort of people bringing whatever projective technique, whatever ism or philosophy they followed, and using that, as opposed to coming without theory and saying, what's going on in the picture? And what's going on when a bunch of people who share something important, like for instance, a diagnosis, what is it that we can reliably see and report on that is similar or different?
And I may also say that the DDS was designed not just in a scientific way, which I think is hugely important, especially given the era in which it was developed, but it was also developed to really be an opportunity for a client to create art. I know Barry has a great interest in art, probably even more so than science, especially back at that time. But the materials that were used really give clients an experience of art making as it may occur within the context of art therapy. It uses artist quality materials, the chalk pastels. It doesn't use markers or pencils as many other art-based drawing assessments did. It uses crisp, large white paper so people could be expressive and fill a page. As I was studying, I was a student in the early 90s at GW, and we were learning different assessments. And I know as a student, I appreciated administering this test in my practicum sites more so than some of the other tests because of the materials. I wasn't having to use the smelly markers that a lot of people didn't like, or use the kind of that gray paper that the Kramer assessment used. So the materials really worked well for me and the clients that I was working with. And again, the three drawings rather than one really give a broad, give the clients an opportunity for broad expression. And we get to see how a person responds to multiple different types of tasks over time. Some highly structured tasks, some more open-ended tasks, feeling-based instructions. So we get a really, really great array of images from the client. And Barry, did you have more to say about that?
Why don't you tell what the tasks are for people that don't know the DDS?
Sure. So there are 3 instructions for the DDS. We use a pack of 12 square chalk alpha color pastels, 3 sheets of 18 by 24 inch white heavier duty drawing paper with a little bit of a tooth. And the instruction for the first picture is to make a picture using these materials. Completely unstructured. They're provided the materials, and they have up to 15 minutes to create whatever they wish on the page. The directions for the second picture are the most highly structured, and clients are asked to draw a picture of a tree. Again, they have 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes for each picture. And the instructions for the third picture are to make a picture of how you're feeling using lines, shapes, and colors.
Nice. And also 15 minutes. So it's a 45-minute assessment in total. So,
and then during the drawings, I would say that we allow the clients to draw, and we don't interact with the drawings or ask too many questions until they're done with all 3 drawings. And that's when we process.
It probably should also be said that most clients finish the entire series in probably 20 minutes tops. The 15 minutes per picture was set as a standard for research, so that no more than 15 minutes per picture is used. But when I was working inpatient, most patients got done in 10 to 20 minutes tops with all 3 pictures. So it's economical in time as well as in cost of administration.
That is interesting too, because you're giving such large pieces of paper for people to fill in, but they're still able to move through the tasks very quickly. So obviously the administration part is standardized. The questions that you're asking of them of what to draw are standardized. What about the processing of the artwork? Is that also standardized, or do you have a method that you teach for that?
I would say that one of the nice things about the DDS is that when you have completed, when the person who's drawing the pictures has completed the 3 drawings, then the art therapist can interact with them in whatever style works for them. To my surprise, some people want to have more guidance than simply say, follow your own style. So we do have an optional drawing inquiry form, which researchers can send in with the drawings when the drawings come to the archive, which then makes it the only drawing assessment that has the client's own associations, the client's own story and words that go with the pictures. Nobody else has this.
Wow.
So it's a really rich opportunity. But again, one does not have to use the drawing inquiry form. We all differ according to the clinical needs of the client at that person, at that point in time, because they're not there, only for research purposes. Even if they're in a hospital setting, they're there for help. And they've really poured their hearts out in these pictures. So then we respond as clinicians. We're concerned to make sure that they leave that session wrapped up emotionally and understanding what it is that they've just done that contributed to making their treatment more effective.
So how does one learn how to administer the DDS?
Kathryn, could you talk some about the rating guide and the handbook and the standardization and the way the pictures are looked at first?
Sure.
Before we talk about the rating guides. So I think Anne described how we do have a drawing inquiry form, and that is just to help guide a clinician in learning to discuss and process the pictures with clients. And there is a standardized rating guide, which that's really important. This is really, really critical to know, because no matter how you process the pictures with patients, that will have nothing to do with the actual rating of what is on the page. So there is a handbook that we've had that we used to mail out with all that expensive postage. It's now in a PDF form that people receive when they come to a Diagnostic Drawing Series training. It includes the instructions for collecting the DDS with clinical populations, instructions for collecting for research purposes. It has the results of the research findings for different diagnostic groups. And the rating guide is an important piece of this. So we rate every drawing on 23 different criteria. And these, again, are quite objective criteria. And we look at things such as the pressure that is used on the page, the line length, the amount of page space used, the number of colors used, a lot of criteria that were not included in older assessments. We do not have content criteria in the rating guide. They are considered formal elements, objective criteria. So there are many ratings. And Anne, would you like to add to that?
Well, actually, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off. I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose Raina's really important question, which is about administration. So I'm sorry, Kathryn, did you want to finish that thought?
No, go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so actually this leads into a topic which is near and dear to me, which is the DDS Handbook, which has changed a little over the years, but it's basically the document that you can go to as a newbie or a person in another country, or an art therapist who has not yet had a chance to go to a DDS training. And you can read that, and it gives you all the information you need about the materials, how to administer, everything is there. And a person, as long as they are a mental health professional or an art therapy student, they can legitimately then go and administer a DDS. Now we keep this secure, just as the standards of testing with the American Psychological Association and others is that you keep tests secure. So we don't put all of this information out on the web, because that would lessen the validity of the test. But it's all there in the handbook, which we might also consider to be a manual, because it has in it everything that a psychological test manual would have. And it was released when the DDS assessment was first publicized. So unfortunately, some erroneous things get said across the years. And one thing that's been said is that the DDS doesn't have a manual. Well, of course, it's had a manual and it's available, and it gives the rationale for the test and its recommended uses, cautions about when it shouldn't be used, and so on. It's accurate information in there. So a person could begin, they could practice using the DDS clinically for years. And then, as some people have, they come to a DDS training and go, holy smoke, I got a lot out of this as just a sensible clinical thing that I've used for years, and it was really useful to my patients. But now I'm going back to them after the training, I'm going, holy smoke, oh my goodness. Now I know the research foundation that's been built out of all these people around the world using it and sending their pictures into the archive and publishing papers about it.
The handbook certainly has the nuts and the bolts, but the standard for DDS training is a 2 to 3 day intensive workshop, often held at the summit, other conferences. We've traveled around the country to teach with different local art therapy organizations and to train. And what you get there is really an opportunity to learn the language of the DDS and really learn how to rate. Even though things are spelled out in the rating guide, it's a different way of thinking about art. It really is there's different language, different way of thinking, and it takes a while to get that mental shift. For that mental shift to occur. So working in a large group and small group, practicing rating, that's what you don't get from the handbook. And you also don't see all the images from the archive that represent different diagnostic groups. And that is by far the most valuable part of the training. We have permission from thousands of clients at this point over the years to include to use their art for educational purposes, but that's not something that we publish, that we have permission to disseminate to the broader
Sure.
on the internet or anything like that. Yeah. So if you were at a training, for example, you may see many samples of diagnostic drawing series drawn by somebody with major depressive disorder, or from clients with eating disorders or schizophrenia. So you really get immersed in the arts. And trainees also have a chance to bring art from their own clients as teaching examples. And so they get to learn from that as well.
I would add to that, out of the, say, 14 hours or so over the 3 days, people learn the language, they learn to use the language, they practice using the language, and they also see the examples that Kathryn was talking about, but they also hear the data from 30 or more years of research, which there's really no simple way to get otherwise until we create a webinar or write a book that shows the differences between all of these different diagnostic groupings, because that's what the DDS was originally created for. It was really a project in which we were seeking to identify both the difference between people with mental health disorders and quote unquote healthy or normal people, if there is such a thing. And nowadays that's much more complex, because literally everybody in the world has PTSD as a result of the pandemic, at the very least. And then to use these 23 rating criteria that are structure oriented rather than content oriented, to create a graphic profile of each of the different groups, so that you can distinguish one group's response from another, so that when you give a DDS and then you write that up in the chart or want to talk to the primary clinician about it, you can say with confidence that as a result of X decades of this research, this client's response was the most like people who have also been diagnosed with major depression, schizophrenia, dissociative disorder, whatever. And that distinguishes the DDS from any other art assessment. We're not making the diagnosis, we're collecting the data so that we can point out and distinguish among groups and give that tool to the clinician, because people need to know diagnosis in order to treat properly. Not every disorder responds to medication. Not every disorder responds equally to clinical hypnosis. Lots of these different techniques are more effective with one population than another. And some of the other art assessments that are out there are good, they're effective, they work with a population in particular, but they don't really address this issue of all these different populations. So that's where the DDS moves from the research piece, which we were advised to collect and understand first, and then move into the clinical benefits of using the DDS and how it can be used in groups, in couple sessions, inpatient, outpatient, etc. So not just for assessment, but also for treatment. So really the DDS is, it's a three-dimensional and multi-leveled tool that all of us are sharing in building together to move the field of art therapy forward on a more scientific basis, and to really, as I understand it, much of the research that's going on in the field now is focused on single cases and narratives, and can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of it is, in my understanding. And what the DDS seeks to do is to broaden the sample into a more universal and a larger groupings of clients, so that the information that we get from it is appropriate in more cases with more people, and not just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 clients with an XYZ kind of situation. And did you want to correct me?
So the DDS came about at a time when there was a lot of emphasis on nomothetic research, which would be research with large groups of people. And yes, as Barry says, then there became more interest or a revival of interest in idiographic research, this particular unique person with their context and everything that is true about them. And that's very important too. And of course, the DDS can be used either for normative group research, but also it could be the thing used within a very sensitive case study, because then it has a bridge back out to a broad foundation of research. But just that what's going on in research in the field of art therapy is even broader than those two options.
Yeah. So I know we're talking a lot about art therapists using this tool, but can other mental health professionals who do not have a background in art therapy also utilize this tool?
Absolutely. Kathryn?
Yeah, so I know that Barry designed this for use by anyone, any mental health professional that comes for training in the DDS, which was a little bit novel. I know back when I was doing my training, when there was such a push for only art therapists to practice anything therapeutically art-based, but this is a tool for anyone. We have a lot of clinical social workers and other mental health counselors that receive the training, probably a few psychiatrists. And so anyone with interest can get trained for sure.
Okay, excellent. I thought that was the case, and wanted to make sure. And I think that that also makes it unique in that it can be used by any mental health professional, and it's not isolated in a silo just to art therapists. And I think that helps the field of art therapy in so many ways, because other people are getting exposed to, wow, there's real benefit, and this is important work, and it should be taken seriously. So I think that as a credible reason for using the DDS too.
You know, back in the early days, the first people to pick up on the DDS were the clinical psychologists. The first 2 articles about the DDS were written by the American Psychological Association in their newsletter, and in Holland in psychology magazine, Psychologie. And so they understood the importance and the benefit of using the art as a way of dealing with people in a nonverbal way, but also the importance of using a standardized tool and not just the paper and pencil kinds of house tree person stuff that were floating around back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which are not taken terribly seriously in the world of clinical psychology, but seem to be revered in the field of art therapy, at least when I was coming up in the ranks. And I did the training with Manuel Hammer. When I was in graduate school, I went and sought that out in the house tree person to understand what we needed to improve on, because it really, the little piece of paper and a pencil didn't really make sense for what we were trying to communicate. The other thing is that, you know, you're right that you can't any longer control art making to just art therapists. And the summit was my way of providing a structure to have people who know the right way to do things teach people who are not trained in art therapy to use art and dance and drama and music safely and thoughtfully and responsibly with their clients, because they love it, they see the benefit of it, but they're not going to get that training. They're not going to go back and get another master's degree in art therapy, but they want to use the arts. And now expressive arts, I think, if I may say, possibly due to the influence of the summit, is everywhere in all other fields. If all you have to do is open your email box and see a new book on expressive arts and play therapy, expressive arts in the treatment of X, Y, and Z, expressive arts and sand tray. It's just around now. People are using it because I think people definitely got the idea of what the arts can do. And I am proud that I think both the DDS and the summit have really contributed to that proliferation. But we also have to be careful now how it gets used. And most art therapists, because art therapy is not really art therapy education, as far as I understand it, is not really codified like, say, medical education is. And these are the courses and the skills and stuff across the board. There's no standardized assessment tool. There's no assessment tool, for instance, that all our therapists need to use or need to learn. People are taught the DDS, for instance, by people who never were trained in using the DDS. And so, this is an issue for me, that people need to spend 14 hours and learn how to use it from people who know how it should be used. And that's why I think the trainings are so important, because it can be taught. And I could go on, but one of the arguments that I got into with Janie Ryan during her lifetime was she had a hard time believing that we could teach people how to assess psychiatric diagnosis based on their drawings. She thought that was just too much to even suggest that was possible. But we could, and we do it in every DDS training. And that's a really important thing, that not only is this thing standardized and done internationally for decades, but it's teachable. And all people have to do is learn the right way to do it. And that's our crusade now, is to get more people to learn how to do it the proper way.
Yeah. So, Anne, you were going to say something.
Just to kind of recenter on what Barry was saying and what you were saying, Raina, about the DDS being able to be used by other mental health professionals, and how that has a different effect maybe on how it grows and is regarded. We have had this international support that involves research done by people who are not necessarily art therapists. They may be psychiatrists and so on. And then internationally, the DDS has been a springboard in the Netherlands and in Latvia to, as part of mental health bills for the rights of the patients in the entire country.
Can you explain a little bit more what that means?
Sure. So the art therapists who worked with the DDS, who live in the Netherlands and who live in Latvia, have successfully lobbied the government to create standards for mental health treatment, stating that art therapy and the Diagnostic Drawing Series will be used in the treatment of depression or of borderline personality disorder.
Wow.
So building the bridges and building on the research and standing on each other's shoulders, it gets us not only seeing beyond the little walls of art therapy, beyond the walls of mental health professions, but into government policy.
Wow, that's pretty incredible, to have the Diagnostic Drawing Series recognized legally in another country. That's quite an accomplishment and a testament to the work that you've put in And
our colleagues have. I mean, this is
yes,
this is an all volunteer project around the world. So people put in a lot of time to collect pictures and make their studies and collaborate with the archive and so on.
mm-hmm. So I know we kind of moved away from the administration of it, but there was a question that I am curious about, given our current climate and how much time many of us are conducting therapy sessions virtually. Are people conducting this assessment virtually, or can that be done?
Yeah. So I did write up instructions for how to do this because the last new client I took on, the week that I closed my practice down and went virtual, I had to collaborate with him to get the art materials and have them ready, and have a big enough table to put the piece of paper on that he had the right drawing materials. And he administered it, he photographed it, he sent me the photographs. Later, I taught him how to write the date on the back in the proper way, all that stuff. And, I had to say, nope, try again on that one. That's not a good enough photograph. So that worked well for a clinical situation. Obviously, we weren't collecting pictures for the archive, but if someone's coming to a training these days, that's what they're often doing. They're collecting digital images that they've administered properly over some synchronous video platform.
Very cool. Very cool. So tell me a little bit about where the DDS is heading and what you're working towards, because I understand that there is some efforts being made to create some piece of technology to help with rating. Maybe I'm expressing that incorrectly.
You're expressing that correctly. Yes, exactly. So, of course, technology has grown leaps and bounds since the DDS was developed, and we're fortunate throughout the years to have had an international archive. We have databases of information, ratings for so many series now. So what we've been working on and what we have now is as a scoring algorithm. So an algorithm that will do what we do during trainings, which is looking at the research as it exists, combined with a little bit of expert knowledge to rate. Well, the individual still has to rate the DDS. We now can input the ratings into the computer, and it will look at degree of agreement with different diagnostic groups. And so right now, I believe we have 7 different diagnostic categories programmed into the algorithm. And we're looking at adding a few more and getting that up on a platform so that individuals who've received training and understand rating can subscribe or get onto this website, and rather than go through the tedious process of reviewing all the normative profiles, get a degree of concordance with the click of a button with different diagnostic groups. And I'd love for it to be an app that could be on our smartphones. I think it's going to be a web-based thing for now, but I think that it wouldn't be much of a leap to someday be able to have that on your smartphone, where you do the ratings and plug it in and get the scoring done.
Yeah, maybe if there's a web developer, app developer listener on the show, like maybe you want to volunteer for that project.
Exactly.
That would be really cool.
We're
actively looking for a web developer now to do it, because, right, the goal is you just click down the rating form on your computer on a web browser, and hopefully someday, 1,000 DDSs in your pocket, in your phone, and then click a button. And when you click a button, you get a bar chart that says percentage of similarity to schizophrenia, major depression, blah blah blah, down these 7 or more categories. So you get an instant read on the diagnostic assessment the second you rate the picture. So you don't have to know all of that stuff and remember it in your head from the training, but you still need to learn how to reliably rate the series. But on those lines, back in the early days in the 80s, we went to an ATA conference for the very first time with the rating guide and put, I don't know, 30 or 40 art therapists in a room. They had never seen the rating guide. It had never been used by anybody but us. And they rated a series with no training whatsoever. And some people walked out of the room because it was too hot. And we still got in the 80s, 85 or 87% concordance in that quick and dirty study that we did, which is
significant.
A very, very high success rate for something like that in general, let alone one that nobody had ever seen, we're not trained in, etc. So with training, the reliability and validity, we haven't really talked about that stuff, but all of that is quite high. And another aspect of the DDS that other tools simply don't have. Yesterday I happened to be on Facebook for a rare visit, and aside from seeing some of the great things that you've been cooking recently, Raina, I saw a new assessment listed.
Oh.
And a thing that I have thought over the years about art therapists is that they're so creative that they're always looking to make new assessments. But what they don't think about is the responsibility to their clients in not having any data about the validity and reliability of the tool, and how that using that assessment is going to impact the person that they're responsible for working with. And we're here as a testament to 40 years off and on of slogging through every technology that existed since 1982, and international collaboration and blind studies and all kinds of things with to create this service really for not only our field but for the mental health fields. So it's really important that people think twice about adopting tools, art-based tools, that don't have that history or data or solidity behind it, because it's fun, but it's not really responsible. That's my opinion about it. That you can't just keep cooking, to keep using that Facebook metaphor. You can't just keep cooking meals. You've gotta clean up the dishes and develop the recipes, and you have it's a whole gestalt that takes place over years. It's like having a baby and leaving it on the doorstep and walking away. You can't do that. And we've had to raise the DDS for decades just to get it to the point that it is now. Yeah,
it's definitely been a lifelong process of caring for this particular assessment, and an investment of time and energy, and of course money, storing all of those pictures, right? I know I visited Anne's office many years ago before it was shut down, and I know you had flat files with all of these there. And how are you all maintaining that collection? Is there like a plan for, passing that torch on to the next generation of DDS assessment. I don't want to call him a fan, but like, somebody who's passionate about this work and this tool as you all are.
I would say that is a very on topic for us these days.
It's on topic. So it's
Yeah.
in discussion of like, what are we doing next?
Well, it's
Yeah,
hard to
yeah.
find such a person. And the questions of digital versus in real life are complicated because a portion of the DDS archive is photographed, but the JPEGs are not the same as the pictures.
No.
And it's part of the complexity of maintaining the archive, in real life, in files, and whether and where and how and who would take this responsibility on. And people will write all the time thinking that we could somehow give them a link to the DDS archive and they can scroll through 1,000 DDSs online with all of the diagnostic information, all that stuff. And it's a nice fantasy, but it's not necessarily a sensible thing to do in certain ways. I think Anne, she's the director of the DDS archive, so she should really speak to it.
So to my knowledge, the DDS is the most researched standardized art assessment in the world. And to my knowledge, the DDS archive is the largest archive in the world of standardized drawings. So knowing and feeling that the hard copy art is important to preserve.
Absolutely.
This is a problem facing all art archives. And I have an unfinished paper about archives in Paris, in Zurich, and in California, that people built across lifetimes, that Jung built, and so on. And what happens to their art? What happens to the patient art when it comes down to the next generation? So we've got our eye on that ball. We are measuring that ball and describing that ball, and we're going to roll that ball forward.
All right.
This brings up something, just a little tidbit that sort of never fails to amaze me. The DDS is the first and only, as far as I know, art assessment that describes how adults draw.
That's
as
fascinating.
Simplistic as that sounds, when it came time to do a lecture out west, probably 25 years ago, it finally hit us that there's only one book that even approaches that. It's long out of print, published by Johns Hopkins, of medical students' human figure drawings. So A, it's not the general population. B, it's mostly men. C, they're pencil and paper drawings. And D, they're human figure drawings. But in terms of non-artist art making, right? Because DDSs are not art, they're art assessments, and they have no financial value because they're not art. Say like the Prinzhorn collection in Germany was, because that stuff was really, in a sense, fine art by mentally ill people. But nobody has ever studied how adults draw. And the DDS, by creating by norming what non-diagnosed adults do when given these three tasks, is the only study of its kind to describe what a healthy drawing consists of.
That is really, really interesting. But I think it makes sense for people that don't consider themselves to be artists. Many adults haven't created art since, middle school or grade school or something. I know when I do art therapy with adults, they're like, I don't know what to do. I haven't done this since I was a kid, and I was terrible at it then. So it makes sense that people that don't identify as an artist, that there would be research on their mark making. Right? Anne, you want to say something? Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm
Yeah,
jumping
please
in
do.
again.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. So the ethics of the American Art Therapy Association tell us as art therapists, we must make note of strengths. We have to do strengths-based charting and report writing. And so how are you going to do that if you haven't had a DDS training? Where we actually tell you this is what people who know psychiatric diagnosis, how they draw. And you're not just making it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. These are the healthy factors.
These are healthy
because
factors.
that's part of what
here's
we
the
look
strength.
at too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. You say,
Not
oh,
just pathology.
here's a person with this disorder, but we also see these strengths and we can name them, and it's based in research.
That's fascinating. One thing I know we didn't cover, it goes back to this topic of the research being about adults. What is the age range that this was normed for? I know we've had conversation before, Barry, about how it's not used with children, but I don't remember the cutoff range for age.
The DDS is for teens and adults, so age 13 and older. And we have found over the years that there are some differences between the way teens draw and those 18 and older. Mm-hmm. So several groups of my students, when I was teaching assessment and research, actually looked at differences between teens and adults for several diagnostic groups. So there is a normative study for controls, non-hospitalized teens versus adults, and I believe those with PTSD as well. And so we do keep in mind some differences for the 13 to 17 crowd. But this is not for 12 and under.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to ask, because I know you had made mention, like people ask for a link to like see all the things, but there is a specific website. Does the website for the DDS, the DDS archive, does that have a comprehensive list of the empirical research that has been done to support the DDS? Anne?
The original site did. The current two sites, diagnosticdrawingseries.net and diagnosticdrawingseries.info. .info has general information about upcoming studies and general information about the DDS. And diagnosticdrawingseries.net is the place to buy the packets. And the packet contains within it the resource list, which is essentially a bibliography of many pages of resources. But no, currently that's not available online.
Okay. But it is, if you purchase the packet, you get the bibliography with all the references of all the empirical studies that have been done.
Yeah, and it's $20 that goes towards the expenses of storing the DDS and all that stuff. And the site that Anne just mentioned just has a button on it, and you click it, and it's PayPal. It's $20, and you get it automatically emailed to you.
Fabulous. Well worth the $20. It's a bargain.
Well, that money goes to the DDS Research Award, to that web designer who undoubtedly will find us after listening to this podcast, Raina.
Developer, not designer. We need a web developer, right? We will pay them out of those funds.
Awesome. So when is the next available opportunity for listeners that might want to invest the time in the intensive training that you offer, the deep dive where you get access to everything? You can see the images from the archive and learn how to codify the images. When can
That'll
people
be
do that?
Coming up May 12th, 13th, and 14th. It's a 14-hour training. 2 5-hour days and 1 4-hour day as part of the singular sessions from the Summit series that we do every month. And it's taught virtually. And we've spent the past couple of years learning how to teach the DDS virtually after more than 30 years of teaching it in person. And each day people learn a different chunk of learning how to work with the DDS, understanding the language, practicing, and it takes a period of sleeps to go through for your brain to rearrange all of the data so that by the end of the third day, it makes sense, and then you can be on your own to practice using it, because you have to use it and practice it in order to be good at it. But you're doing it knowing how to do it, what the language is. And we also provide a notebook that includes that $20 packet, but it also includes other stuff that you can only get in a DDS training.
Gotcha.
And we've been lucky in the virtual trainings. People literally from all over the world have participated and have the benefit of that multicultural aspect. And I think Anne could probably name some of the languages that the basic directions for the DDS tasks have been translated to, but also in a few instances, like I think the Latvian one and the Korean one, the entire DDS packet has been translated, and we have one just coming available soon in Brazilian Portuguese as well. But Anne, do you want to just mention some of those languages?
So in addition to the Latvian and Dutch, where all the DDS materials, the rating guide, the handbook, everything is translated, the Korean version of all the materials has been back translated into English, which is ideal because then we can check for any distortions that might happen. And then the basic DDS instructions, which is enough for anybody to get started with, are in Arabic, French, Spanish, Japanese, German. And have I left any out?
Probably. And we welcome anybody that wants to volunteer to translate any part into any language if they're working with a population. Mostly the short ones just say how to administer a DDS and give the directions. But some of these other ones have been fully translated into other languages, which is
Very
really
cool.
nice.
That is awesome.
And again, all volunteer, much appreciated.
So if people wanted to connect with you all to volunteer with the archive or with developing or translating, or even, find out how they can contribute to the archive, how would they get a hold of you? Where would you like them to go?
Most people write to me at a landmark, LANDMARC @cox.net.
Okay.
And then they
We
ask,
also
go ahead.
And we also have a diagnostic drawing series at gmail.com.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we're all happy to help support folks in any way with their research projects. If they're interested in, translating or finding out about training opportunities, we really hope people will connect with us, or to help teach in their local programs. With technology now, I know Barry and we can all
Right, I Zoom in to teach classes on request for people who are doing classes on assessment. And we're happy to look over anybody's paper or article or book chapter to make sure that what they're saying is accurate, or to help them out in any way to get their materials published. And as Anne mentioned, we offer an annual DDS Research Award. It's not given every year because people don't often submit, but we give, and how much is that award?
It's somewhere between 300 and 500 now. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
and
Sorry.
for research that's in process or finished, featuring the DDS.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to send people over to the diagnosticdrawingseries.net, diagnosticdrawingseries.info. And of course, if people want to take the next training, the upcoming training, which is in May, the beginning of May, they would just go to the Expressive Therapies Summit website, www.expressivetherapiesummit.com. And there should be a button for singular sessions,
That's
right?
correct. That's the center of the 3 buttons between the East Coast button and the West Coast button.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you'll
And it
find
will be listed there.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I appreciate all of you taking this time out of your Saturday to record this episode and share all of this amazing information with listeners. I really think that it's going to be valuable for people. And I hope that they're inspired to learn more about the DDS and how it can be used to enhance the work that they're doing with clients. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Raina.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
for
lot,
your
Raina.
wonderful podcast.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Creative Psychotherapist Podcast. If you enjoy listening to the show, please, please, please let us know by subscribing, liking, or leaving a review wherever you listen to the show. We would greatly appreciate it. And as always, we just greatly appreciate your listenership. I hope you enjoyed this particular episode of the podcast, and I hope that you left the conversation feeling interested and excited to learn more about the Diagnostic Drawing Series, no matter what creative modality or discipline you happen to practice, because this assessment is available to anyone, not just art therapists. And I hope you also appreciated hearing from people that have really dedicated their life's work to creating something that is sustainable and really helps to validate the work that we do as arts-based therapists. And that's all for today. I look forward to sharing next week's episode with you soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.